So, it's good to see you all. Hope you had a good Thanksgiving. Last week we talked about the Puritans, and if you'll recall, the Puritans got their start in England in the early 1500s, not long after the Protestant Reformation, and the first group of Puritans made their way to America on the Mayflower, which is part of what we celebrate at Thanksgiving, in 1620. And then the Puritans sort of dominated intellectual life in the colonies for about the first 100 years or so of the colonies. So from the early 1600s to the early 1700s, the Puritan way of thinking, the Puritan way of operating society really was the dominant system in the colonies. And we talked last week about religious liberty and how was a complicated question with the Puritans because they had been on the underside of things in England. They had been a persecuted religious minority. They came to England, they came to America and set up, they were not interested in a separation of church and state. They very much believed in an intimate connection between church and state. Not a Roman Catholic Christendom, but they very much believed in a Protestant biblical Christendom, in closely weaving together church and state, which makes them actually very different in their thinking from almost all modern Americans today. And so today we're going to talk about part of that process as to how did they go from this really close idea of Christendom, of church and state married together. How did we go from that to a situation we have today where that seems almost unthinkable, even to most modern American Christians? So that's where we're going. And what happened in between is something called the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment began in Europe as an intellectual movement in the late 1600s and went through the 1700s and in many ways is still very much with us. So, any thoughts before we jump into the Enlightenment? Any thoughts from last week? So I'm going to tell a fairy tale now. I have named this the great myth of the modern West. And this myth, even though it is a myth, is incredibly powerful today. It is the prevailing story of the modern West. It's the main story we tell ourselves. Not just secular people, but most Christian people believe some version of this myth. And the myth goes something like this. Are you ready? So in the Middle Ages, some of these things are true, but you can figure out what's myth and what's reality. In the Middle Ages, virtually everyone believed in God, in miracles, in the saints, in the sacraments, in demons and angels. Everyone believed that the earth was the center of the cosmos, that the earth was a few thousand years old. Everyone believed that spiritual power was real, that the spiritual realm was real, and very much a porous border between the physical and the supernatural. That the access to the spiritual world could be gained through holy living, through prayer, that God involved himself in human affairs, that angels and demons involve themselves in human affairs, that the Bible is true and is the true descriptor of reality, that everyone after they die, go to heaven or hell. That, we're speaking of the Middle Ages now, that the Catholic Church had the authority to say who went to heaven and who went to hell, and used this power to influence kings and nations. That the church in the Middle Ages, or in this myth, it's usually called the Dark Ages, that the church suppressed any dissent, any challenge to its authority, using excommunication, using burnings, using the Inquisition. That the physical objects in the world around us and the events that happen in the world around us are never just physical things. They're never just random events. That everything is interpreted through a theological lens. So good harvests mean that God favors us. Plagues mean God is angry with us. I don't know what just happened there. Yeah, I'm not going fast enough. Sorry. That people who lived in the Middle Ages were simpler people. They didn't know any better. They were sort of just turnip eating, knuckle dragging, ignorant peasants, right? But then, this is how the myth goes, right? But then modernity arrived and everything began to change for the better. Two things in particular happened to change the medieval world into our current modern world. The first thing is science. The medieval Europeans were challenged by encounters with reality through the scientific world. The earth no longer came to be seen as the center of the cosmos, but merely just one rock, the third rock from the sun, in a vast galaxy of empty space. The rocks in geology suggest that the world is actually much older than 5,000 or 6,000 years old, that these scientific discoveries raise uncomfortable questions that challenge the authority of the Bible and the church. Darwin's theory of evolution means that there's really no role for God in creation. What's sometimes called the God of the gaps, where God explains the gaps that we can't explain. Those gaps get smaller and smaller every time some new mystery is solved by science, until the need for God more or less disappears altogether. The other main thing that, in this myth, the other main thing that changed everything was war. The Protestant Reformation split the world, split European Christianity into splinters. Protestants were killing Catholics, Catholics were killing Protestants, and the unity of Christendom and the church was shattered. These wars of religion, so-called, they were dominated Europe, and they culminated in the 30 Years' War, which we talked about a couple weeks ago, in the early 1600s, in which a third of the German population was killed. This myth goes on to say that the moral authority of the church began to look really shaky in light of all of its divisions and its violence and the brutality of Christian colonial conquerors toward indigenous peoples in the Americas and Africa and Asia. And over time, enlightened Europeans came to see the need for tolerance in their own nations and benevolence to conquered peoples, which would ultimately lead to the abolition of slavery, abolition of empires, abolition of state religion, the rise of democracy, the abolition of monarchy, abolition of the patriarchy, of repressive sexual restrictions, and really no longer any need for God himself.
Have you said anything untrue yet?
What do you think, Newton?
I'm
You're tracking with me? Okay. So when did this great birth of modern freedom and tolerance and knowledge and democracy and human rights, when did this arrive? The story goes that it arrived in the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment thinkers of the late 1700s, they sat in their Paris salons and they denounced the ignorant, intolerant church for its backward, irrational bigotry. And as knowledge and tolerance grew, God shrank, and sectarian violence made Christianity undesirable, and scientific progress made God unnecessary. That's the myth of the modern West that dominates almost all of our educational system, dominates almost all of our media and entertainment, is the backdrop for our political dialogue. That's the wallpaper of the modern West, is this myth. Does this sound familiar? Okay. The only problem is it's almost entirely false in its actual facts. There's some half-truths in here, but in general, it's a factually false narrative. So here's something more like a true story of what actually happened. Actually, as we've seen the last couple of months, medieval Europe was a lot more diverse in its beliefs. There was real doubt and real dissent and real protest all throughout the history of the medieval Roman Catholic Church. The scientific and technological breakthroughs that we see in the 1600s and 1700s, they don't actually challenge belief in God at all when they arise. In fact, almost all of these scientists were themselves committed Christians and saw themselves as exploring the glorious mysteries that God had created and the laws that God had created into a predictable universe. Priests and missionaries, instead of leading the persecution of indigenous peoples, were often the only voices speaking up against the conquistadors and the conquerors in Africa and Asia and South America, speaking out long before any Enlightenment philosophers got involved. And in fact, most Enlightenment philosophers were incredibly racist. The wars of religion resulted far more from political disputes, growing nation states bumping into each other, far more than anything that was theological. In fact, Protestant Denmark fought against Protestant Sweden. The Catholic Bourbons fought against the Catholic Habsburgs. Protestant Saxony supported Catholic Bohemia, and Catholic France supported Protestant Germany in these wars of religion, right? That were supposedly just Christians fighting each other over doctrine. And many of the most dehumanizing verdicts on indigenous peoples came from the Enlightenment thinkers who explicitly rejected the Bible's views of human beings made in the image of God. Most of this is lifted from a really great book. I would highly recommend this book by Andrew Wilson. It came out probably about 2 or 3 years ago, called Remaking the World: How 1776 Created the Post-Christian West. So we can come back to that. It's in your notes too. So before we go on, let's talk about this. How did this myth become really the gospel, the unquestioned gospel of our modern educational system? How did it become the unquestioned gospel of our media and entertainment complex, our political debate? How did it become basically the unquestioned belief of the modern Western world? That's the story we're going to look at this morning. And this myth was a story woven by Enlightenment thinkers in the 1700s, largely the late 1700s. Today it's assumed as fact. Unfortunately, a lot of Christians piled onto this narrative in an effort to discredit the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages. I have lots of problems with the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages, but a lot of these, there are legitimate doctrinal issues that Protestants have with the Catholic Church. But many of these false accusations were piled on by Protestant Christians trying to discredit the medieval church. Well, we can come back to that story a little more later if you'd like. But questions before we get into how this myth kind of got crafted and became the wallpaper of the modern West.
Did the Christians know that this wasn't true when they were spreading it?
That's a good question. I don't think I'm probably qualified to answer that. Probably some knew better, probably some didn't. But.
If I were to guess, I'd say it came from the top down.
It was an intellectual elite movement that started with a small group of elite intellectuals and filtered down through society. That's correct. Yeah.
Religious leaders too?
Yes, unfortunately, a lot of these people, we'll talk about specific men, usually largely men, who perpetrated these ideas, but most of them were raised as Christians and then either completely rejected Christianity or rejected Orthodox biblical Christian teaching. Yeah. So this is, I'm going to tell you now, a true story. This story is about a man named Jean Calais. I don't know how you pronounce his last name, it's French. He lived from 1698 to 1762. He was a middle-class merchant from France. Crucially, he was a Protestant Christian in officially Roman Catholic France, which made him a second-class citizen in his nation. And Calais had a son who was apparently considering conversion to Catholicism from his father's Protestant faith. That son was found dead with rope marks around his neck. Initially, the death was ruled as a suicide, but later the local magistrate changed his mind and thought, what if this was actually a murder staged as a suicide? What if Jean Calais murdered his own son to prevent him from converting to Catholicism? So Calais was put on trial. He was convicted and condemned to death by torture. Calais maintained his innocence all the way through the horrific torture that led to his death. They were trying to force a confession from him. He maintained his innocence to the very end. He said, "I die innocent. I do not pity myself. Jesus, who was innocence itself, died for me by even more cruel torments." So it's a sad story of Jean Calais. He was later exonerated by the state. But what's that?
A lot of good
Yeah. So as we said, this story happened in the, as we say, the mid 1700s. Yeah, 1762 was his death. Here's a guy we've mentioned before. He just looks like kind of a squirrely guy, doesn't he? This is Voltaire. If I had a Mount Rushmore of villains, he has kind of a permanent place on my personal Mount Rushmore of intellectual villains. He was Europe's most celebrated author in the 1700s. Voltaire seized on this true story of Calais. Voltaire was French. He seized on this story as a model of the church's bigotry, a model of the church's corruption. Voltaire was one of these guys who was raised Catholic, given a great education by the Jesuits. But this is a quote: he viewed Christianity with a hatred that bordered on fixation. He was an ardent evangelist against Christianity, prophet of a new age of freedom, casting out the demons of superstition and bigotry. He signed his letters, abolish the, this is in French, abolish the abomination, meaning the church. He said that people walking in darkness, the darkness of medieval, the church and religion, have seen a great light, which came to be called the Enlightenment. More about Voltaire. Here's another quote. For the first time since Constantine, if you remember 300 AD, for the first time since Constantine, the commanding heights of European culture had been wrested away from Christians. So basically from 300 AD to the 1700s, the Christian canopy had held, and this is when it really starts to come apart, at least at the top, right, at the intellectual level. Voltaire wanted the world to be born again under a universal religion of rationalism. He wanted humanity to be seen as a common brotherhood. Anybody ever listen to the John Lennon song Imagine? It's an awful song, the words. This was the world that Voltaire was aiming at, to remake society in a radical way. Ironically, Voltaire was criticizing the church using distinctly Christian categories. All of his critiques were, he's measuring the church against the yardstick of Christian virtue and Christian morality to say that the church doesn't measure up. He probably didn't realize, or he was just being dishonest about the categories that he was using to criticize the church itself. So thoughts on this. Voltaire became probably in the last 20 years we've had what's the new atheist movement with Dawkins and Hitchens and these guys. Voltaire was like all of those guys put together and really reshaped intellectual thought among the intellectual leaders of Europe at the time. Yeah, Amanda.
So would you say, that he was right in saying there's a problem, but he was diagnosing it incorrectly?
Yeah, I mean, there were problems in the medieval Catholic Church, right? There was real corruption. Some of the things that Luther was pointing to, Voltaire was also pointing to, right? In that sense, actually Voltaire liked Luther. He just said Luther didn't go far enough. Luther should have just abolished the whole thing. Instead of reforming it, he should have just... Interestingly enough, Voltaire wanted society to maintain belief in God because how else is it morally going to hold together? He just didn't like the authority of the church or the Bible or... he didn't believe in it, but he wanted the peasants to to continue believing it so that they wouldn't... so that something would be morally cohesive in society.
How did the church leadership respond?
Yeah, of course, they very much did not like him. He was a very wealthy guy. You couldn't get away with saying these things if you're a peasant. You'd probably get put on trial and killed. But he had various homes throughout Europe, so he could kind of stay on the move and continue to publish and put out pamphlets. Yeah. This is again the myth of the Enlightenment, leaving childhood ignorance, always being told what to do and how to think by the church, by the Bible, learning to think for ourselves, moving from darkness to light. If you pick up on this, these are actually all Christian metaphors, right? The Dark Ages, 1,000 years of stultifying grimness in which people spent all their time burning witches, eating turnips, and dying of the plague, until modern Europeans arrived and switched on the lights. It's a quote from this book. It's a really readable or listenable book too. If you want to get this on audio, he's a phenomenal writer. Here's a fairly famous poem a line from a poem by Alexander Pope said, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." Not this Newton.
Hey,
So the Enlightenment,
don't
that
act like it's such a,
far-fetched idea. I don't think you would fit very well in the Enlightenment view of the world, Newton. So I don't know if your parents named you after that Newton or not. Maybe they did.
no, as I tell people, it was his last name, it's my first name.
Yeah. We'll talk more about Newton in a minute. So rationalism is the idea that truth is discovered by human reason, not by revealed religion, not by God revealing himself through Scripture, or by God revealing himself through Jesus, or through church tradition or church teaching. The embrace of reason is supposed to be to remove the heat and keep the light, right? Here's this little cartoon says, "Have you accepted the scientific method into your heart and given your life over to empiricism and reason?" These are two missionaries of reason at the door. And he says, "Who are you guys?" The Enlightenment went very well with an idea of God called deism. Deism is a view of God that God is like the metaphor that was most common was God is like a watchmaker who made the world, wound it up, and then just set it down and walked away. The other convenient thing about such a God is he makes no ongoing claims on your life. Right? Many of the Enlightenment thinkers were not explicitly atheists. Many of them were, but many of them just moved to this kind of middle room of deism, where you still could conveniently believe in a God, and maybe the peasants need that God, but he has no claims on me. Deism says God loves you, he just doesn't want to get involved. Right? That's deism. One of the main heroes of the Enlightenment was Isaac Newton, who lived in the late 1600s. His laws of physics were new understanding of the physical world, and provided a way to understand the universe that seemingly didn't require a God. That Newton's laws seemed to give us a closed universe, a mechanical universe that could just run on its own on mechanical laws and doesn't require God intervening with miracles and silly superstitions like that. Newton actually himself was a Christian, although not a very orthodox Christian. He actually believed in alchemy and some crazy ideas. But he didn't disbelieve in God. The attempt in the Enlightenment and ever since, to apply Newton's laws to human beings and human societies. This is why we call it social science today, right? That there are mathematical laws for how humans behave and how societies behave and how nations behave. And if we can just identify what those laws are, then we can finally run society on rational lines and get rid of all this messy, religious, traditional, personal stuff. That we can have freedom from tradition and dogma and religious superstition. That's not what Newton believed, but that's how Newton was interpreted by the leading Enlightenment thinkers. And so we can finally achieve certain knowledge of the universe from figuring it out by our rational minds. We can grasp the universe fully in all of its component parts because it's just a natural world. It's just a mechanical. It's just atoms bouncing around and molecules. And if we can figure out how they bounce and how they interlock, we can basically solve everything, including all of the messy human problems that have been going on for as long as anybody can remember. Right? So it's coming to view the human being as a complex machine. The brain, this is used later, obviously computers didn't exist yet, but we tend to think of the brain today more like a moist computer, right? So these metaphors get imported into how we think about all kinds of things. So one of the main stance, this is a quote from Colin Gutton, the main stance of the Enlightenment is supreme human self-confidence. Supreme confidence in human reason to figure out everything. I'll stop here. Thoughts or questions, or is this making sense? Does this sound familiar? I mean, this is the basic belief system of modern Westerners. Whereas Augustine, the great theologian from the 400s, he said, if you do not believe in God, you'll never understand the universe. The Enlightenment said, if you believe in God, you will not understand the universe. Right? That belief is actually an impediment to understanding. It's an obstacle to understanding. Beliefs handed down to us from the church, from tradition, are automatically suspect, right? Automatically, by default, considered superstitious and wrong. So the fierce rejection of authority handed down from previous generations or from any outside source, outside the self.
It's interesting that they felt like they could not blend those two. Because some degree both are true. I mean, Newton's laws and the understanding of the world, a lot of those have held up to be true.
Right. Right. So there was this kind of false narrative that pitted Christianity against science, rather than science actually being a product of Christianity, because Christianity believed in a God who wasn't like the Greek gods who just changed their minds every 15 minutes and constantly creating chaos. So you had to believe in a God who created a world in order to believe in science, which is why all these early scientists were Christians. So again, that's a false narrative that's been created that pits science and religion against each other, rather than science. What science ought to be is just a discovery of the world that God made, right? The good things that God has created, right? Which shouldn't be frightening for Christians at all. Should be, what did Proverbs say? It's the glory of kings to discover the mysteries of the universe that God has created, right? Yeah, what other thoughts? Go ahead, Buck.
A couple of things that are interesting about this. The fact that it's easy to lampoon the church for failing to measure up to its ideal.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a layup. For people, of course, we fail to measure up to our ideal.
That's always going to be an option.
We have an ideal.
Yeah.
And we know what's right and wrong because that's what God tells us. They're trying to get rid of God and his authority and explain the existence of what we see without needing God there.
Mm-hmm.
And it leaves them so bereft of any value system. It's just a flaming disaster. It reminds me of a parenting class we took from the state when we started foster care. And I just belly laughed and at this guy. He was standing up in front of the class telling us, well, the reason that foster kids misbehave is because they don't know the right thing to do. All you have to do is tell them what to do and they'll do it. I just force laughed.
Right.
Like, you've got to be joking. So
Right.
I said directly to him, so you've never purposely done something you knew was wrong.
Right.
And he had no answer, of course. He told me I was a very difficult student.
Well, I was going to ask you and Mike. Mike's not here this morning, is he? Because Mike has spent his career in the trades, and we talked to doctors. Yeah. But, oh, there's Mike. Okay. So, how would this work in plumbing or pipe fitting or medicine or any kind of education? It makes education impossible, right? If you can't receive inherited wisdom from outside yourself, and you have to recreate knowledge in order for it to be legitimate, it makes education absurd, right? Impossible, actually. Does that make sense?
You'll quickly die if you have 10 liquids in front of you and you have to experiment on which ones will be
Right.
healthy or not.
I hope you have 9 friends.
But yeah, you better
10
you better have some
friends.
faith in what people
Yeah.
are telling you.
Right.
But is that, so do you think that, I mean, that is like a kind of the mantra of every generation that,
In some ways, it goes back to Adam and Eve, right?
right?
It just hadn't been promoted from the heights of culture like it was in Western culture from, you could say, from Constantine until, there are always people who wanted to get free from God's authority. That has always been true, that will always be true, right? But the sense in which this was promoted from the heights, from supposedly the best minds of the culture, was a new thing in Christendom Europe. Yeah. Does that make sense? So here's a bumper sticker. Have you ever seen one of these bumper stickers? This is straight out of the Enlightenment, right? Question authority.
And then they get pulled over.
Well, you'll appreciate this. But what if you had a bumper sticker that said "Submit to proper authority"? You'd probably get pulled over for that, right? Like, what's wrong with you? I like this one. She says to her dog, "Come on, get in." He's saying, "Question authority." And unfortunately, I have to say, these ideas don't just stick to the left. They migrate across the political spectrum. The leading philosopher, so Voltaire was more of a publicist, evangelist, if we could use that word. The main philosopher of the Enlightenment was a German guy named Immanuel Kant. Here's some quotes from Kant. He says, "It is inappropriate for anyone to receive instruction from anyone or anything outside one's own reason." The same idea, right? The dignity of a rational being who obeys no law other than that which he enacts himself. This is the triumph. Someone else, Carl Truman, called this the rise and triumph of the modern self, right? If it didn't come from you and your choice and your will, it's not valid, right? Empiricism, another big word from this period. Empiricism means basically the only things that we can know to be real are the physical things we can discover with the 5 senses and put in a test tube and repeatedly measure, right? Any kind of knowledge that's outside of that is suspect knowledge, maybe not knowledge at all. So spiritual knowledge from revealed religion or tradition is not really knowledge of reality, right?
Looks really young or looks really old, but he must be a teenager. Both
boy.
Yeah, right. He would fit very well with the average teenage boy who only wants to think up his own ideas, right? Not that anybody we know is like that. Here's another quote from Kant. All our knowledge begins with the senses, proceeds then to the understanding, that's the rational mind, and ends with reason. There's nothing higher than reason. So obviously there's no place for God in this system. The Enlightenment view of government is that a secular state run on rational principles as a grand, benevolent, neutral parent run by experts who will use rational principles to fix everything. This is coming out of Hobbes, largely. So the state is supposed to function, to focus on technical expertise. It's supposed to not, because questions of right and wrong, good and bad, those are sort of religious questions. So those get left outside this wall that we put around the state. And the state is supposed to concern itself with technical nuts and bolts, figuring out just how things work, and then operating society on expertise kind of lines, rather than trying to solve the unsolvable questions of right and wrong, good and bad. Those are too contentious. They just cause conflict. So we have to keep them outside public policy debates, right? This is why we keep using this example, but the COVID debates, you're not supposed to bring in questions of right or wrong. It's just supposed to be about the science, right?
How's the judicial system then?
Yeah, it's actually incoherent, right? Because in this way of judicial thinking, legal thinking, you're just supposed to have laws that are supposed to be neutral laws that aren't connected to. We hear the phrase over and over, you can't legislate morality. It's nonsense. That's the only thing you can legislate is morality, right? Where do any laws come from except it's not right for you to steal my stuff or kill me, or those are moral principles that we built into our law, because what else are you going to build law on, right?
You can't rain on Saturdays.
Right. Right. So, keep the wall high between religion, which doesn't really count as knowledge of reality, on the one side, and on the inside, where the decisions are made, the state making decisions of public policy, which should be made on rational, material grounds, not on things like religion or morality or tradition. Does that make sense? So what you end up with, this guy says, I want you to keep your religion out of my government. It's a particular embargo, a particular bigotry against religion, implying that religion is a uniquely dangerous threat to society. Does that make sense? If you try to bring a religious argument into a public policy debate, you won't just get, people will think you've done something wrong. You're uniquely threatening to a good political process, right? Let's see. So religion gets disqualified from public debate. There is no official definition of right or wrong, of good or bad. The state has already decided it won't involve itself in these kind of matters, supposedly. But in reality, no state can function without saying, these things are right for a person to do, these things are wrong morally, right? And so all kinds of these values get smuggled in the back door. They're still involved. It's just not an honest process, right? So the problem is, right and wrong are supposed to be replaced by rights, just rights for individuals, right? Here's the problem is, what if my individual right clashes with your individual right, right? Then which right trumps, does my right trump yours or does your right trump mine, right? Let's say that I want to raise foxes and you want to raise chickens. Like, who has the right, right? I want to raise seed corn and my neighbor wants to raise organic. Well, hopefully I'm not stepping on any toes here. But like at some point the state has to come in and adjudicate when my rights crash into your rights, right? When the right of a woman over her reproductive future crashes into the right of the baby to live, whose rights trump whose, right? Someone still has to decide who gets to use the girls' bathroom, right? So in these rights contests, all kinds of values, they have to get pulled in, right? But they get smuggled in the back door kind of dishonestly, right? So the religious people maybe are admitting where their basis for their values come from. The secular people are not admitting that the basis for their values are also not really grounded in science. Science can't tell you right or wrong, right? Science can tell you how to do something. It can't tell you whether or not you should do it. Does that make sense? So over time, what this leads to is a new kind of totalitarianism, sometimes been called the authoritarianism of secularism. We'll explain that in a minute. So this might be the most sublime expression of this idea. This is by the Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy. He wrote the majority opinion for Planned Parenthood versus Casey in 1992. I still can't, he says the quiet part out loud. He says, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. The key meaning, one's own. If you're going to be free, you have to define reality yourself, right? This is a straight up distilled Enlightenment idea. Does that make sense? Problem is it doesn't work because at some point my definition of existence and meaning in the universe is going to crash into yours, and then somebody has to adjudicate which one trumps in the law, right? And then values get smuggled back in. Does that make sense? Anybody ever watch the movie, this is Beauty and the Beast, Disney's from maybe 20, 25 years ago. You have a young woman who likes to spend her time in the library, and she's sort of an enlightened free spirit, and it's the peasant, ignorant town people who are keeping her repressed, right? And she's trying to break free of the ignorant, knuckle-dragging religious peasants. Being kind of hard on this movie, but I think it's essentially true. In this idea, the primary role of the state, of state government, is to guard the freedoms of the individual so that the individual can pursue his or her own private version of happiness, not encumbered in any way by community or tradition or religious influences or other groups, right? It's safeguarding the individual to do what the individual decides it wants to do. That's the logic behind abortion, right? And lots of other trans stuff. That's all. The trans individual has a right to participate in women's sports, even if he has all boy parts, right? And the state is protecting that individual's right to do that. Problem is, it's conflicting with the right of some woman to lose her spot on the team, some actual woman, right? But the law has to choose between the rights of these these individuals, and that's the logic there. This is a more modern quote. This is only about 100 years old, but it captures this idea well. The worst thing to happen to God would be if he fails to democratize himself, to get on board with the modern program and stop being so authoritarian, right? So, I mean, there's lots of problems with these ideas, right, which we've been talking about. But one of the problems is this idea that everything in the past is shrouded in darkness and bigotry and ignorance, that these people from the past are just knuckle-dragging imbeciles. All you have to do is walk around Europe. This church was made in the 1100s. Nobody could build this stuff today, right? I mean, to think that the people who built these things were, it's just silly, right? And you read the stuff written from these time periods, a lot of it is far more philosophically brilliant than anything that's being produced today. The writings of Augustine and Aquinas, yeah.
When I was 8 or 9, during a church sermon, I discovered that 22 times 18 is the same as 20 squared minus 2 squared. 20 plus 2 times 20 minus 2. I discovered it independently, as I'm sure many boys had. Then,
I'm not sure about that, but go on.
then in 6th or 7th grade, my algebra book had a little historical note on page 87 or something or other. What I had discovered had been discovered by a Greek almost a century before Christ.
Mm-hmm.
They were not all idiots.
No, you look at the art and the sculpture from these periods, and nothing we produce today matches any of it, right? Including the intellectual output, right?
Anything that is technologically advanced is built on everything that was learned.
It's exactly right. And Newton said that himself, not this Newton. That Newton said the same thing. He said, I stand on the shoulders of giants. I'm only building on what somebody before me. I can only see higher because I'm standing on somebody else's shoulders. Right? And all of these things are things in the created order of the universe. The universe is not random molecules bouncing around. There's a created order that's being discovered, a good or a beautiful order, an intricate order that's being discovered and received with gratitude. I think that's maybe one of the main differences between the conservative mind, the conservative constitution, and sort of a liberal progressive, is the conservative mind looks at the created order and says, thank you, God, I didn't make this. I didn't construct this myself. The good things from my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, thank you. The person who taught me in the trades, that I didn't make this up myself, thank you for passing this down to me. I want to preserve it and pass it down to future generations. That's the essential conservative way of thinking, whereas the essential liberal progressive idea is that's all garbage, we've got to remake it ourselves so it'll finally be right. It's a really hubristic, proud way of seeing reality, right? It has to ignore all of this stuff, pretend it didn't happen, right? So we're repeating ourselves here, but I think we've demonstrated really clearly the last couple of months that all of the best fruits that we have inherited today in modernity, our democratic system is something we can be thankful for. But all the best fruits have their roots not in the Enlightenment period, but way earlier than that. and all the way back to Jesus, and Jesus, who was the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophets, ultimately all created by a good and loving God, right? Well, I think we got through it. I didn't think we would get through this morning. This was a lot. What are your thoughts?
It'd be really interesting how the artificial intelligence now that we are finding that's running really, really fast, how that's going to dovetail into kind of the philosophical thinking. And because, I mean, we truly are finding things that so much faster, still based on science.
Yeah. It's processing speed of these computers. The thing, I haven't given a huge amount of thought to AI stuff yet, but some people are terrified, and I understand why. One reason I'm not maybe as terrified, or maybe I'm legitimately terrified. A computer is not a brain, and it doesn't have a will. A computer is only going to do what you tell it to do, what you program it to do. And then it can do it really, really fast, maybe way faster than you can. But it's going to it doesn't have a will of its own, because the brain is not a computer and the computer is not a brain. When you think of the computer as a brain, or the brain as a computer, then you think, well, maybe this computer will develop its own will to run the universe and kill us all. But it's only going to do that if we program it to do that. Right?
It's going to force us into some really back into moral questions.
Oh, everything forces us,
That,
yes.
You know, we just had a conversation about.
Yeah.
It's going to come back around in an even more, I think, difficult way. It's
Right.
going to force the church
Right.
to grapple with both policies and things around morality relative to.
Right. Yeah, secular politics pretends to push out all of those questions of morality, which is a sham. You can't push. They always keep. You can't live with that. They always keep pushing back in. Right? So either you're going to be honest about how you make those decisions, or you're not, and we're generally not. Yeah, Amanda.
Something just that I noticed, and you can actually read your comment, is how is that going to affect their morality or different things like that? Maybe you didn't say it clearly, but what came to my mind was even how we as my generation, and maybe others too, but when we have a question, we go to Google and ask Google. We don't call our parents or call a friend and ask them. And that goes not just to how do I make this, what temperature do I bake this turkey at, but it goes to why do I have this problem, or why am I angry all the time, or like it's answering these moral questions. We're going to Google for moral answers.
Right.
And yeah.
And what people are discovering is when they type in their question to these main chat, AI-generated chat things, is they're giving, like if you asked it to justify Joe Biden presidency, you'll quickly get and if you ask the same thing, can you justify a Trump? So they're doing what they're programmed to do. They're spitting out answers that they're programmed to spit out. It's not this rational, neutral. There is no such thing as neutrality, right? There is no neutrality anywhere with anything. You're going to have to pick a side. I don't mean fighting against people who are made in the image of God. Sometimes we have to resist people, but there's no moral neutrality for anything, right? That's a charade we've been playing with ourselves for about 300 years, and that's why the people talk about the liberal order that we have now is breaking down, and moving towards something called post-liberalism, because liberalism was, I'm talking about not like conservative, not like Democrat and Republican, but everybody in the modern West is liberal in the sense that we believe that there shouldn't be the church dictating to the state, that there shouldn't be questions of morality in law, that these should be neutral. That's classical liberalism. It's breaking down because it was never true, right? It was never going to hold because it was a lie. You can't remove questions of moral questions from governing human societies because they're always going to push back in. We were operating on a moral system that was the Judeo-Christian inheritance. As that is leaking away, it is going to be replaced by some other form of morality that will be inherently religious, because that's what we are as religious moral beings. It's just going to be a different competitive moral religious system that's pretending that it's still secular and rationalist and neutral.
Somebody has said, all our questions are theological.
That's true. All of our questions are ultimately at bottom theological questions. Yeah.
Well, and it's no surprise that that there's more and more brokenness and that there's more of an Eve dynamic
Right.
throughout all of this. I mean, really, there's nothing
Right.
new under the sun. And so the fact that slowly we think we can be our own gods, and that's
Right.
passing through all of these
Right.
different facets of society is no surprise.
It goes back to Genesis 3, you shall be as gods, to Adam and Eve, right? That's the Enlightenment. You shall be as gods. And reality always gets to bat in the bottom of the ninth inning, right? Like, if you go against the grain of the universe, you will get splinters. Reality always gets the last say. God will get the last say. Right. We're out of time. Mark, would you close us in prayer?